Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Tim Walberg. Congressman, I appreciate you coming on today.
It's good to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Earlier this month, you reintroduced the Fifth Amendment Integrity Restoration Act, also known as the FAIR Act, with Representative Jamie Raskin. Can you give us a history behind the legislation?
Well, this legislation goes back at least 3 terms now, including this one, with an effort to get it brought forward and more people to understand what civil asset forfeiture is, that it's not criminal asset forfeiture. These are people that have been brought in under civil laws, at least perceived that way. And the problem that we've found out is that in most cases, they have not been given any due process. Their assets have been seized for sometimes dubious reasons or certainly unknown reasons. And then they have to spend significant time to get their resources, whether it's their property or whether it's personal assets or money, back. And in most cases, we find out that they should never have been charged with anything. And it's mounted up, and I think now more and more people on both sides of the aisle are understanding it and see it as something that needs to be fixed. We don't want to hurt law enforcement, don't want to take resources away from them that they could appropriately have, but we also want to make sure that civil rights are held up as they ought to be. So that was the issue, and it came to the point that both sides of the aisle, and in this case, Jamie Raskin, a Democrat, and myself, a Republican, both saw the concerns. And like I said, for the past now 3 terms, we've been working toward the solution, been developing allies. The last term of Congress, which got caught up in things like January 6th and the like. Yet we still had the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, as well as the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, along with the Freedom Caucus and the Progressive Caucus, the Squad, and other members who were supporting my bill and were co-sponsors of the bill. So we're very hopeful that this time, this term, we'll be able to get it across the line.
I do even want to take a step back further. You've been working on this now for about 6 years. So where did the initial inspiration come from?
We began hearing reports about violations of individual rights and liberties and the violation of due process. The first one I heard was a small grocer, inner city, who was required by his insurance company, if he wanted to have coverage for any loss of his receipts on a daily basis, that they would only cover up to $10,000 per day. So dutifully, when he reached that level, he would head to the local bank and deposit his $10,000. And of course, all of a sudden, that became a normal deposit number, and it crossed the boundaries under laws that are in place to make sure that money laundering, et cetera, are picked up. And so all of a sudden, he was picked up. His $35,000 of assets were frozen, and he spent the next several years trying to get it back. And for a small grocer, $35,000 of assets could be a death knell for his success. Then we heard about a young man who'd saved up $16,000 to try to make it out in Hollywood in the production field, and got on a train and was heading toward Los Angeles and stopped in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And federal agents boarded the train and ultimately took his $16,000 from him, taking away life savings going toward developing a career. We've heard of other stories like that, and then ultimately constituents who had friends, children who were in college or just started out after college and were depositing. All of a sudden, assets were frozen and a difficulty in getting them back. So we decided we'd pick it up. We had conversations with a number of entities dealing with justice, such as the International Justice Foundation, and an Institute for Justice. And we picked the bill up thinking that it would be a pretty easy sale. It hasn't been. But like I said, over the course of time, as we've educated more people to understand it, that we're not taking attack at law enforcement authorities, we may feel very, very frustrated with the FBI, who have sometimes used it egregiously. Most recently with a lady who had decided in Los Angeles she was going to protect herself against spending what she was saving to purchase a home, decided to make a long story short, to put it in a safe deposit box 30 minutes away from her residence, making it very difficult for her to get at it and spend it. And all of a sudden that business that had the vaults for the security was raided by the FBI. And for 2 years now, she's been trying to get her $40,200 back, and has finally decided through the Institute for Justice to file a class action lawsuit to get it back. And the FBI did not carry out the terms that the judge allowed them to do the search and seizure of the facility. And as far as I know, many people have been impacted by this, and that's the type of thing we have to go after.
Congressman, what you're describing now, you're describing civil asset forfeiture laws as basically guilty until proven innocent, which is the opposite of what it should be. So why isn't this an easy sell?
I don't know why. To me, it seems common sense. It seems that people on the left and right should accept this, and any member of Congress who is taking some pressure from local law enforcement entities saying that this will hurt them from being able to get after money laundering, drug sales, etc., and then not be able to use those assets for additional law enforcement resources. They really aren't telling the truth to legislators, but legislators sometimes get brought in on that. I, for one, want to make sure that our law enforcement agencies have all the resources that they legally should have, and that local communities, state legislatures, and the federal government, Congress, should make sure that our law enforcement are given the resources necessary to do their jobs. But that does not come at taking away First Amendment liberties and taking away the right to due process and the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty, and to have assets taken and held at the expense of the, in many cases, unaccused individuals. And so it has been a bit frustrating, but like I said, I think we have grown in the ability over the last several years of having people educated to what this really is doing. And I, for one, have had very little pushback from law enforcement now, since they know what's in place. There's another thing that has been used. Michigan, for instance, ultimately, when they found out about this, subsequent to my bill being introduced, the Michigan legislature did a reform on civil asset forfeiture and really put in place what we want to put in place with this federal law. But there's still a problem that the federal authorities, like the FBI, can have equitable asset sharing process by which they go to the local authorities and say, if you help us on this particular drug bust or money laundering scheme, we will provide you with sharing of the resources that come from the bust in the end. That goes around the state laws, puts the local authorities in concert with the federal investigation entity, and we end up violating what the intentions are of the state legislature, specifically in Michigan, on this. So this bill would also do away with that, or put strings on equitable sharing opportunities using federal and local or state law enforcement resources.
I do want to talk about equitable sharing, because that, to me, when I was researching your legislation here, it seems like a pretty big loophole that directly benefits state and local enforcement agencies. Right. So what are those strings you would put in place aside from abolishing that?
Well, it's pretty much abolishing it. It says you still come under the state laws in this place, and you can't do an end around unless there's a clear and pressing need, that a judge, a separate judge, would give that opportunity. So it puts restrictions in place, really, that you already have with criminal asset forfeiture. It still allows the tool, which we want to be there. But in this case, we want to make sure that a private citizen is cared for in the same way you would do one who has already been judged by the court of law to be of criminal intent, and the assets are then frozen or stolen, not stolen, taken, because the person is guilty. This is not the case with the certainly illustrations I've given to you already today. To have civil asset forfeiture and then a leverage point, a pushing point coming from the federal law enforcement agents to get around state law by having civil asset forfeiture under federal statutes, and equitable sharing that takes place, is really just a loophole that is being used improperly, and really, I would say, against the letter as well as the spirit of the law.
I do want to break down your legislation even further. So the FAIR Act has been described by yourself and Representative Jamie Raskin as legislation that, quote, raises the level of proof necessary for the federal government to seize property, reforms the IRS structuring statute to protect innocent small business owners, and increases transparency and congressional oversight. So let's break it down. Let's start at the top. How would it specifically raise the proof required for the federal government to seize property?
Well, number one, it prevents the evasion of state forfeiture laws. It ensures forfeiture victims fair access to the courts with representation paid for if necessary. It places the proper burden of proof on the government. That's where it ought to be anyway. It protects innocent owners of property from forfeiture. For instance, if a prostitution ring or a drug ring is on the property, clearly unknown to the owner of the property, and is functioning out of there, even from a third party that comes on and uses it occasionally, you can't just take the property. And it sends federal forfeiture funds to the U.S. Treasury, keeping it out of the hands of individual law enforcement agencies, or federal agencies as well, and gives a certainty that the individual citizen or property owner will ultimately be able to get their resources back in a expedited fashion.
So the law enforcement agencies themselves would no longer benefit from civil asset forfeiture?
Correct.
Okay, and so what would be the reforms now for the IRS structuring statute to benefit small business owners?
Again, it's a complicated formula that will go into effect, but it makes it very clear again that as you structure it, it goes first and foremost to the property owner, and then ultimately, if there is adjudication that there was some wrongdoing, then it goes to the appropriate authorities that would benefit from it for the services that they rendered to get to the bottom of the civil infraction.
And what about the congressional oversight component? What is your legislation doing specifically to increase transparency?
Well, I think we also have, as always, we have the opportunity to bring the law enforcement entities in front of us to do oversight. And that's really the only way that Congress does continue the oversight function. We have the ability to bring them in front through subpoena or otherwise for any reason that we deem necessary to make sure, for instance, that the FBI hasn't reverted back to making false claims to a judge or incomplete claims to a judge in order to get the search warrant to do what they plan on doing. And it's not much more complicated than what goes on now, but it's put in the law to make sure that civil asset forfeiture has the same protections that criminal asset forfeiture has as well.
And Congressman, you've said before that it's too easy for the government to seize a private citizen's property. You even agreed now that at its face, civil asset forfeiture laws are guilty before proven innocent. So how did it get this way?
I think it just morphed into it. Patriot Act and other things that had good intended purposes initially to make sure that we got against illegal activities, drug running, money laundering that came from organized crime, etc. We had the ability to go after them. And certainly criminal asset forfeiture, when a person is actually adjudicated in a criminal code offense, I don't think there's anybody in society that wants a legal framework to function and crime to be taken off the streets, mind that a criminal loses their assets. But when you have an individual citizen in a civil case who hasn't even been given due process, that's a concern. And I think it developed over time as law enforcement agencies saw another means by which they could use this as they went after money laundering and drug running. They could use the assets to help them further resource them with drug teams, with crime prevention teams, with syndicate efforts, that here are some assets that we could use in purchasing electronic equipment and purchasing transportation tools, all sorts of things. But then it went beyond that, and we even saw some agencies, local agencies, buying publicity equipment, using assets. A Corvette Stingray that was seized and forfeited. Now I can put it in the local parade and paint it up like a law enforcement vehicle. All of the crazy stuff that began to take place just because the money was there. And I don't think the majority of law enforcement agents themselves and police officers thought of it that way. But it was because it was allowed. And then we began to start hearing these tragic stories of innocent people being caught in the trap of something that was never intended for them. And then the stories of how difficult it was for them to get their resources back. And I think myself, Jamie Raskin, and others, in hearing from constituents, these stories began to say enough's enough. This is not what law enforcement is to be about.
And you mentioned Congressman Jamie Raskin again. Obviously, this is a bipartisan bill, and 2 additional Democrats, 2 additional Republicans also co-sponsored it as well. So why do you think there is such bipartisan support when it comes to this issue, when it comes to your legislation?
Well, I think it simply comes to civil liberties. Conservatives and progressives and everyone in between believe that one of the uniqueness of our country is that we are innocent until proven guilty. We all deserve due process under the law. And if that breaks down, then we have no certainty about how any of us will be treated. And I think that's where we come together. We may come around the circle from a different perspective to start, but in the end, we come back to individual liberties that must be protected. And I think that's why Representative Raskin and I, from the 2, I think, ends of the spectrum, can come together on something as important as this. And I appreciate the fact that he, being a noted law professor and attorney, as well as a progressive, can join with a conservative like me. And hopefully this time can get this done.
And in the spirit of bipartisanship, are there any other policy areas aside from this one that you can see in this term working with Democrats on?
Well, I'm sure there are. We saw last week on the issue of TikTok. As I said on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the chair and the ranking member and colleagues on both sides of the aisle took a very strong stance against what TikTok was doing and their very clear connections to the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's there. In the area of veterans issues and senior issues, there's plenty of space where we can come across. I'm hoping that there's areas on energy that we can come together on in dealing with climate issues as well as just the general public. So there are a lot of things that I think we can look at. We've seen to a great degree on the issue of Ukraine, bipartisanship, even though the news media, the national media is now talking about Republicans dragging their feet a bit. It's not so much dragging their feet as saying, listen, we just want transparency. But I think the key issue of making sure that Putin doesn't come out the winner in aggressing against a sovereign nation, those are items that I think are in too few cases talked about as bipartisan agreements that may not be 100%, but could get 80, 90% agreement, and we can move it. At least in the House, I can say that.
Congressman, that's interesting when you list those areas that you can see yourself working together with Democrats on. I've talked to some of your colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, and almost everyone, when I pose that question, they immediately say veterans issues too. That's always on the top of their list.
Right.
Right. So just finally, let's say that I know that you reintroduced it recently, but let's say the legislation is signed into law tomorrow. How long would it take before it's completely enacted and working the way that you intend it to?
Well, I'm not sure of the exact number of months it'll take running the law through, of course, the Senate, as well as being signed by the president. I think he'd sign it. We will take that trip to the White House, as it were, in the not too distant future to see if we can get him on as our ally. But then it goes through the normal course of process. But I would hope that if we could pass it early on this term of office, that by the end of the term it would be functioning and in place, and the local law enforcement entities, as well as the FBI and others, the Justice Department will make it very clear that there's a new provision in town and you must follow it. At least we would hope that when we get into the next term, that citizens across the board will know that they'll be treated at least as good as common criminals. And that's something we haven't been able to say for quite a few years.
Congressman Tim Walberg, I appreciate you coming on and explaining your legislation.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the educational opportunity.